Good afternoon. Thank you, Philip, for this introduction. Great pleasure to be here. So thank you for all the organizing parties for to invite me and giving me the opportunity to speak about the issues of center and periphery, which, as far as I can see during this conference, has been discussed in several ways. Different interpretations of what center and periphery could mean. Proximity and distance, concentration and dispersal, concentration of power, for instance. And it seems to me that we are at least talking about two different centers and peripheries. One might be described as a kind of topographical map, a mapping what's actually central in a geographical sense. And the other one is very much a mental map. It struck me yesterday when Marietta was speaking about Slovakia, that there was this general belief that Slovakia is not in the center and outside Bratislava or even more in the periphery. Well, if you look at a map of Europe, it seems to me that's pretty central. And it reminds me of what happened quite often when I was editing A10 and traveling for the magazine, that whenever I was somewhere, people were talking about Europe as if Europe was something else. As if I was only in Europe, I never went anywhere else. Always in Europe, people said, yes, we're here, we have a problem. Unlike Europe, or we are here, but elsewhere in Europe. So it seems that this idea of not being in the center is sort of crucial in the understanding of many Europeans. The relation between center and periphery is not only about geography and distance. I'm going to try it again. It's working. Now it's working. Since 2004, I've been studying, trying to understand Europe and its organization. And I think this conference is one of the means to reassess this balance between center and periphery. What I'm going to tell you is partly some general observations, partly it's a reflection on what I've been hearing the last 1.5 days, and it's partly a personal story. Because for me, the interest in center and periphery started around the year 2000. Before that, I can say I was pretty ignorant of the whole issue. I was living in the Netherlands, writing about Dutch architecture, and writing this book, Supermodernism, which was about almost the opposite of center and periphery, suggesting that in the age of globalization, everything was more or less the same. In 2000, I was invited to come to Tenerife, which is the biggest island in the middle, Canary Islands, to speak about Dutch architecture and about supermodernism. And I was invited by Juan Palermo, and I'm very grateful to him, because when I was there I discovered how interesting the architecture of Tenerife is. And I realized that the architecture you see there, you would never meet anywhere else in Europe, and it was hardly given any attention at all. Work of Luis Cabrera, one of the architects, and the other one was Rupert Henriques. Finding the work of those architects opened my eyes in a way, and also the work of Juan Palermo himself, which I think is quite interesting. He's also a fascinating personality. And to continue this personal story, this is Herzog and de Baron, which was built recently, one of the buildings which was published internationally, unlike the previous things. The other important moment for me was a trip to Tallinn. I was invited by Mart Kahn to come to Tallinn, and that was maybe my second or third trip to the former communist area of Europe. And this also was for me crucial. It planted the seeds for my later interest in Central and Eastern Europe and for my ideas about A10. There's something very personal in this. I'm always liking the B side of things. I'm not interested in the hits, but I'm interested in the flip side. And so I've been never writing about very famous architects so far, but also always trying to discover something else. I have a problem with this system of positive feedback, that what is famous becomes more famous because it's already famous, which leads to an overdose of publications on just a few architects and objects. And I see it as my, let's say, it's my personal interest, this B side, but I see it also as an obligation for anyone who is in the business of writing about architecture to try to expand the percentage of architecture which is actually covered in publications. It goes on, this idea with this, the B side, the lesser known thing. This is something which I've discovered recently, the work of Fries and Moltke in Denmark, in Aarhus. And they made some very fascinating works in the 1950s and 60s, like these beautiful houses. If you look at architectural media, there is a very common situation that certain places appear to be in the limelight at a certain moment. And those places seem to be the only parts of the world where something interesting is happening, like Spain, and in particular Barcelona, around the late 1980s, then a bit too far maybe, but this is Switzerland, the early 1990s, and then something happened in the Netherlands in the late 1990s. And looking at this pattern within Europe, those are the places which were covered in every single magazine. You can see this kind of serpentine movement from one place to another. So I've been speculating for a while, this was around 2000, what would be the next place if it was kind of continuous movement, this serpentine thing. And indeed, nowadays we can say that Denmark is pretty much in the limelight as the place to be. It's one of the limelights maybe, but at least it's one. And we have very good news for Todd Saunders here, that if this line will continue, Norway will be the next step. The idea with A10 was that in this age of digitalization, in this age of connectivity, everything could be in the center. And this whole idea between the difference between center and periphery, between hotspots and places where it's much cooler, is not really reflecting the reality. And this is for us the starting point of A10, the magazine, which I started together with Arjan Groot, who died 2 years ago. We started the magazine in 2004, and here you see some of the covers of the issues. In the meantime, because when I started A10, I had only a gut feeling that interesting things were going on in Central and Eastern Europe, because I only had this one single visit to Tallinn as confirmation, and it proved that there was indeed a lot of interesting things going on. In that sense, I feel that A10 was a timely publication. While editing A10, I started to work on another project together with Hans Larsson, an architect who was and still is in the Netherlands. He's not Dutch, he's from everywhere. And what we tried to do was making an exhibition of mapping Europe and understanding the organization of Europe. And here again, there's something very interesting. This is, let's say, the main urbanization of Europe, where you see a line from England to Turkey, more or less. It's kind of northwest, southeast. And you see something similar, share of population in cities with over 100,000 inhabitants. This is another one showing agriculture intensity, which is more or less from the southwest to the northeast. And here, tourism, which is everywhere, which is good news. Also, if you want to organize an IBA somewhere, you know there will always be tourism. And this is maybe the most interesting one, also for people here. This is the density of monuments and UNESCO sites, for heritage sites, so not natural sites. And this is more or less the line from Hamburg to Italy, so from north to south, which is showing that quite close to this area we have, let's say, the kind of crossing point of those three lines, which means we are here in an extremely interesting area. Even though you can see that nowadays there's more emphasis on a larger part of Europe than before, still it's true that there is an overemphasis on the West. There's much more interest for what's going on in the western part of Europe than in the eastern part of Europe. In that sense, we still have all those slightly judgmental ideas of how Europe is organized. This is a project which I always love to show from a Bulgarian graphic designer who made this Atlas of Prejudice. And this is the interpretation of Austria, and this is the interpretation of Germany, which is maybe slightly more flattering. This idea of center and periphery, this idea of differences, is crucial still. So we all have kind of judgments about the others which are in the center, or maybe the others which are in the periphery. And one telling example is that this huge atlas of contemporary world architecture, which was published in London, was describing the world as follows: that Europe was dominating, and within Europe, the UK was even more important. Sorry, Murray. And within UK, London, where the editors were based, was the most important of all. There's a kind of self-centered notion of how the world is structured, which I have to confess I know so well, because being in the Netherlands in this limelight for a decade, in the 1990s, it took me a while to realize that if you're in the limelight yourself, your vision is really limited and everything around you is dark. So this ignorance about what's going on is obvious. If you look back in architectural history, you can say that there is a long tendency of paying more attention to the West than to the East. This is a map from a book published in 1965 about the history of European architecture. And this is a spread, a double page, and as you can see, almost everything is on the west side of this spread. The East is hardly covered. And again, there is this self-fulfilling prophecy of this positive feedback that since the West has been studied so much more, it's published more, and it will remain like that. And I try to compensate that, for instance, with my book European Architecture since 1890, and of course, when it comes to contemporary architecture with A10. But then it's telling, it's just this week I got a copy of the Russian edition of this book, which was published in Moscow by a Russian publisher, and they changed the cover, and what they put on the cover was a picture of the sunset looking through the American pavilion designed by Richard Buckminster Fuller for the Expo in Montreal. And I thought it wasn't very helpful for the cause of European architecture. This idea that there is an East and a West hasn't always been there. It's partly the product of the Cold War, you could say, but it's having deeper sources. For a long time, Europe was divided in the north and the south. The south was the cultivated part. The Romans were there, the Greeks were there, but especially the Romans. And this continued well into the Renaissance, that there was this idea that the south was cultivated and the north was barbaric. And this continued for a very long time. It started to shift slightly with the Holy Roman Empire. Having this title was already saying something, that there was still this connection with the south. And then during the 18th century, the whole conceptualization of Europe as divided into a north and a south changed because of the prosperity of the West. And quite suddenly, there was this reorientation from north and south to west and east. And I have to say, I'm very sorry to do it in this region, but the East took over, at least in the Western eyes, this role of being barbaric. And this cliché of the East as being wild continued, I think, more or less up till today. One reason, maybe, why this Western dominance continued is, if you look at the process of industrialization and urbanization in Europe, which started, of course, in the UK, in England, in Britain, in the 18th century, and then spread it to move to the east and to the south. And it's no coincidence that this map of the urbanization of Europe going from the UK to Greece, more or less, is reiterated in this map, where you can see this process of urbanization and industrialization in Europe. Again, same idea, where you see that this movement. If you look closer at this urbanization, I think there are many interesting things to discover, and with this I'm returning more and more to this issue of center and periphery. There are huge urban regions, like here in the Netherlands, Belgium, and the north of France and the western part of Germany, where enormous number of people are living in a relatively small area. If you look even more closely, this is, I think, a very interesting image. Once I was driving on the German highway, and I saw a sign in the middle of a field saying that I was entering the Metropolregion Nuremberg. I didn't see any building, there was no sign of any city, so I was slightly surprised. So when I had a chance, I checked, and it turned out that there is this region with Nuremberg and Bamberg and Bayreuth as a big course, which consists of 3.5 million people. So it's pretty substantial. And if you see this, of course, everyone tries to attract something creative. But this is also the other vision of the same area. So it's not metropolitan in the traditional sense of big buildings and lots of traffic. It's a rather rural, not to say bucolic version of a metropolis. But if you look closer, and you can understand this idea. This is the current definition. It's a new definition of urbanity in Europe. You need to have at least 1 square kilometer with more than 300 inhabitants, and it needs to be surrounded by at least 8 other squares and having a total of 5,000 inhabitants, not per square meter, but just 5,000 inhabitants. And then you're a city. And it turns out that with this new definition, 68% of Europe is urban, which is 5 percentage points higher than it was in the previous definitions. And seeing places like, or seeing regions like this Nuremberg, you can understand how it works. That it is an area which is built up from towns and villages and relatively small cities. And in this area, there's this critical mass, there is this density which enables you to understand it on an urban scale. In one of those villages, little towns in this region, there's Eichstätt, in which the rather famous architect Karl Joseph Schattner was working for decades. He started with his own office and then started to work for the church, and he built a high number of buildings there. So he stayed there mainly his own life. In the, let's say, conventional description of the work of Schattner, he's described as someone who is in this little town and stays there for his whole life, as if he's totally isolated. But if you see him as an inhabitant of this metropolis of 3.5 million people nowadays, you get a totally different idea. So he could be framed as, or could be perceived as someone who was in the periphery, but at the same time he was very much in the center. Which is always also true for this large area in the southern part of Poland with Gliwice and Katowice as the core. Individual cities are relatively small there. I think Gliwice has something like 400,000 inhabitants and Katowice officially within the city limits only 300,000. But again, depending on how you define it, this whole area consists of 3 to 5 million people. And again, you see that this European tradition of having many relatively small cities instead of having huge metropolitan areas and nothing else has led to a very even dispersal of cities and villages. So the urbanization of Europe is relatively equal. And so you can see the work of KWK Promes as being a small town, but at the same time it's part of this Katowice area which goes on forever. which means that the whole idea of urbanity, center and periphery can be looked upon in different ways. Which means that proximity and distance is at least partly this mental story. On the other hand, you could say that there is something which is peculiar for relatively small places, which is, yesterday we saw something of Ljubljana when Vaza was telling about his work here. And the interesting thing of smaller places is that it's possible for one architect, if he stays long enough, to make his mark or her mark on a place, like Plečnik did with this large number of projects in a relatively small town. You need to have the power of Baron Haussmann to make an impact on a city the size of Paris, but you can do with less power and have a much more bigger influence if you are in a smaller place. This is a coincidence. They were telling the same story, which is again maybe expressing the fact that everything is framed in architecture history. The same continuation of Plečnik to Ravnikar and then to Bekperovic and all the other younger offices which are active in Ljubljana today. There is sort of continuation, which means it's highly important not to only have this critical mass for the presence of one architecture, but also the critical mass of an architectural community to be able to have an impact and influence on a particular place. There is, I think you could look at it in two ways. There is a possibility to say that there is distance, being in the periphery can be an obstacle, but it can also be an advantage. And I think for this project on Photo Island, it's maybe an advantage that's so far away, because part of the attraction of this building is that it's in such a remote area. And same is true for the work of Petzo von Ehrlichhausen, on which I made this little book. Almost 10 years after the building was finished, a photographer went back to see what it looks like. And again here, this is a building which plays a very, let's say, prominent role in architectural media, while I think the number of people who are actually able to see it is almost zero. And being on the border, being on the X, being in the margin, I think it's no coincidence that many of those projects are located on the seashore. Being marginal can be very, very attractive. And then I think you have to realize that in many cases, this is the kind of marginality of Caspar David Friedrich, who went to all those places in the mountains and the sea, and then went back to his studio in Dresden to make a beautiful painting. Many of those architects working in those very peripheral conditions are not necessarily located in a peripheral place. And even more today, with the connection of the internet, it's possible, of course, to be both peripheral in a geographical sense and being totally central in all other senses. Still, you could say that there is some kind of architecture which seems to do better in rather isolated circumstances. And for me, the work of Mario Bott is always a pointing case. It started in this very delicate and interesting way, and it became bigger and bigger and bigger with the rise of his international fame. Understanding this kind of architecture as peripheral is maybe only when it's in a certain moment of development. It's certain becomes international later on. And the same is true for Luigi Snozzi. Part of his work is in this, let's say, relative isolation, but at the same time he's also building in countries like the Netherlands, so he's taken out of this, let's say, regional context and being included in an international discourse. Some of them are really persistent in their isolation, like Caminada, who has been transforming this tiny little place in the Swiss mountains for a fairly long time now, and quite successful at that. But then also it's included in this international discourse. So even if it's not central, it becomes central as soon as it's entering architectural discourse, architectural media. Listening to different speakers and their position about center and periphery, being eccentric, being not in the center, it seems to me that sometimes it's a clear choice, like John O'Reilly, but quite often I think it's also accidental. You happen to be in some particular place and you're stuck there for some reason, or you just enjoy it and you don't feel the urge to move. This is a kind of similar contrast between if it's an obstacle to be far away from something or an advantage, it's a choice or maybe accidental. And it seems to me that being outside the limelight, of course we can only discuss it as soon as something is entering the limelight because we are giving attention to it, but existing outside the limelight can have great advantages. There's this beautiful book which was published maybe 10 years ago on East Modern Architecture, which was about the architecture of the 1970s, mainly in Bratislava. And the line of reasoning behind this book was that the fact that it was Bratislava and not Prague enabled the architects to experiment much more. And using the periphery, the eccentric, as a testing ground is certainly one of the advantages I can see. For instance, it also worked with all those French architects which were working in the colonies in North Africa, and also when they became ex-colonies. They were much more experimental. They could be much more experimental than they would have been able to do in their own country. Again, to return and to conclude, to go back to my personal story and my interest in B-side architecture, even in a small country with a high density as the Netherlands, you can find examples of things which are deliberately or accidentally outside the center. And one of my favorite examples is the office of Bedeau de Brouwer, an office which makes, for instance, this kind of work. The office started with Jos Bedeau, who is the designer of the project at the top left. This is his very first project. It's his private house and the office, which he designed in 1936. And the office is still housed in the same building, still there. The son, Pierre Bedeau, took over the office and he made, for instance, the project at the top right in the 1970s. Then they got someone from outside the family, Jacques de Brouwer, who's still there. He's now the oldest architect working for the firm. He did the black and white thing at the bottom left. And now the sons of Pierre Bedeau came in the office, Thomas and Peter. So this office exists since 1936 and it's now in the third generation. The funny thing is that this house on the top left is standing in Goorle, which is just outside of the city of Tilburg. Tilburg is not big, Goorle is even smaller. It's surrounded by at least 7 or 8 houses by the same architect for relatives and friends. And what you see here is, I think, a very interesting position, because we all have this idea that we're part of the great conversation about architecture. We all have this discourse in which we participate. We are all living with the illusion that we have some sort of global village, to quote a famous Canadian thinker. And same time, you see that in many bigger cities there is a sort of provincial cosmopolitanism. So there's a kind of balance in that sense that we are all more or less in the same situation. But it seems to me that this office is a proof that being slightly disconnected from the rest can be really helpful. They're producing work which is steadily evolving, and it's funny to see that they are catering for a particular type of client. They're all local, they're all, let's say, the doctors, the notaries, the professors from the nearby university, so they have this kind of well-to-do clients they're working for. They also are well connected to the municipalities. And the funny thing is that in this region, if anyone wants to sell his house, they really market it as a real dough. It's as if you buy a decent pair of shoes, you know? It's not spectacularly fashionable, but at the same time it's highly rated and therefore more expensive. And in this respect, I think it shows a kind of antidote to this global competition in which so many architects are forced to work, and showing a possibility for architecture. In that sense, it's close to what you were saying, John, to become much more local again. And for me, I understand this process of internationalization, and being here as a speaker is maybe again a proof of this situation, but at the same time, I understand that especially architecture can be a very, very local business. You don't go to a doctor 3 cities away from you, you don't go to your notary which is in another country, and I think for many people with architecture it could work more or less the same. So despite all the increased connectivity, I think there is still a possibility to have this very local aspect of architecture, because without being let's say too sentimental about it, architecture is always about making place. To conclude, one more, I'm slightly disturbed and puzzled by one of the things I once read in one of the books of Eric Hobsbawm, The Invention of Tradition, in which he said that quite often notions only appear when they seem to lose their value. So many traditions are invented when they are about to crumble, and the idea of making it into an invention offers a possibility to keep it alive, revive it. And it seems to me, and maybe that's a happy conclusion for a conference is that this whole discussion about center and periphery means that we are already getting beyond it, and that this might be a kind of concluding event for this whole topic. Thank you very much.